Welcome to TCHL 834 Curriculum Development. Today we're going to look at the chapter in our textbook, Chapter 5, on defining enhancement. This is the second E that we're going to take a look at and really get a better understanding of. I'll have to be honest with you, this is probably one of my favorites because of my background in special ed technology, because my focus in the past within supporting those learners who are struggling is really looking at differentiating and personalizing learning, and this is where defining enhancement really sits. If we take a look at what this means, it really is looking at scaffolding, creating sophisticated understanding of the content, and really using a tool that allows us to create some learning paths that we can't do with our traditional tools. So we're going to look at how do we add value with technology? How do we deepen learning? And how do we differentiate and personalize? I really liked how the author defined adding value and 3 types of improvements within enhancement that we can do that add value. So looking at adding value, we always want to make sure that that focus on value add is on those content-specific learning goals. And then there are 3 ways that we can do that. The first is operational improvement. When we look at operational improvement, we're really looking at how can we build that knowledge base on the students' prior knowledge, their skills, their interests. So how are we really tapping into what they already know? And then how can we provide greater flexibility for students to really make those resources more accessible? So this is going to get into that differentiated or personalized learning, those concepts. When we look at quantitative changes in learning, here we're looking at how are we improving that time on task, okay? How does the tool really help us do that? And then looking at qualitative changes, how are we promoting reflection for students in their learning? How are we helping them develop really a richer understanding of that content? So it's really embedded in their knowledge now. So let's take a look first at that operational improvements. Let's focus on this one, i.e. differentiation. Okay? We're all pretty familiar with what differentiated instruction looks like, and that's providing students with lots of different options based on what their learning needs are. One of the ways we can do that is providing multiple forms of media. So for example, even within the module that you're currently doing, we kind of look at multiple forms of media. You have text that you can read. You have video that you can watch. There are lots of different ways to provide students with different options of media based on their learning needs and using tools to do that. That really hits at that enhancement feature of the EEE framework. The other thing we can look at is options for demonstrating learning. So how do students show us mastery of those learning goals? We can have a variety of ways that they do it based on what their learning needs are. Whether they need modifications in what that looks like. Maybe sometimes they produce a video where they're doing a recording of themselves rather than writing, because writing is a difficult task for them. So we can really look at what those options are for how students are demonstrating their learning. And then really automate some basic skills so that we get immediate feedback on where students are, where their holes are. This allows us to differentiate as well. There's a great tool out there called Education City that does some automated basic skills practice for students that really allow us to get that immediate feedback. And I know a lot of you use some of these tools in your classroom that work on basic skills and that can give students that immediate feedback. Also give teachers that valuable information on where the holes and the gaps are in student learning. Now, when we look at deepening learning, we're talking about scaffolding. This isn't a new concept. We're all very familiar with scaffolding. I bet all of you do scaffolding activities throughout your day in your classroom. Okay? We know, research tells us this makes concepts much easier to understand. So tapping into that prior knowledge, pre-teaching vocabulary skills, using visual aids to really help students organize their learning, and doing some show and tell where students are really deepening their learning by explaining their understanding of the concept. Okay, so this just really allows students to demonstrate their understanding of the learning goals in different ways. When we take a look at some of the enhancement takeaway strategies. I like how Cole breaks these out for us. So let's look at some of these. Let's look at the characteristics first of enhancement when we look at scaffolds. So we know that scaffolds really help us reach kind of that higher order thinking, right? So when those instructional strategies for enhancement are built into a tool, so the scaffolding is built into the tool, it gives students opportunities for inquiry learning. Okay, so allows them to investigate an idea, collect data, show understanding. Okay, gets back again at some of those points we just made in the last slide. It also allows students to reflect, which really uses that higher order thinking skill, which is what we ultimately want students to be doing within the content. And allows them to do this on a device and really just not consuming that knowledge, really taking the knowledge and doing something with it. So when we have instructional and strategies for enhancement that are not built into a tool, typically this is where we see students are participating in classroom discussions, or they're talking through a hypothesis together, talking about new ideas for what they're learning through the tool. Okay, students may be practicing reflective thinking strategies or doing self-questioning, and the tool can really allow those visual representations of thinking, like graphic organizers, which I'm sure a lot of you are using graphic organizers in your classroom. That's really not a new concept for us. When we look at adding value beyond traditional tools, for example, differentiation and personalization, this is where we're looking at the technology tool really allowing teachers to, for example, assign students to a reading level group, or allowing students to get that individual feedback on some of those practice tools and apps that we have out there. The technology can also allow teachers to personalize learning for each student's interests. So you can allow students to really pursue a problem based on something they're interested in and can choose a way to share their skill. So again, even the output, they're making a choice in based on their learning and what works best for them. A way that we could do this when the enhancement is not necessarily built into the tool is giving students a checklist or a support sheet. So kind of what they're going to work through to get to that learning goal. What does that look like? What kinds of things do they have to check off and be able to do? Teachers can also assign students to work in similar interest teams around technology. Or students can select just right tools that allow them a choice in how to represent their work. One of the examples that they gave in the book, which I thought was a great app that really meets this enhancement concept, is the Magistory. This is an app that allows students to take pictures and together create a story, and then they can embed audio as they're reading that story into it, and then play it back and listen. So this really allows students to do that co-learning together, which we know is an important skill, and also really develop language and those early literacy skills. Gets them really plugged in to the activity in a different way that we don't traditionally do language or literacy instruction. So this was a great tool that the author shared. Another example that the author talked about was Google My Maps, which this is a great way of really looking at enhancement. This is a perfect example of it. And it does it through several different ways. Okay, we know that it has rigor, so we know that it's really enhancing our expectations of what we have the students produce, because creating a map can be a pretty challenging concept for kids to do. It also allows for cooperative learning. So you could have groups of students participating and researching things like different themes that they're going to plug into their map. And then researching, combining notes, creating a single map that they have produced as a group. Transferring data is another great way of really looking at how to use Google Maps, Google My Maps, to allow students to really look at, okay, we've read a text, we've gone through a graphic organizer, now we're plugging it into the map. So we're really transferring our learning through these various steps and just making it more concrete for us. And then it allows students to really make and test a hypothesis. So there's a good link on here that you can take a look at, and I provide it within the instructional resources and Edutopia article on the 10 reasons to use Google My Maps in the classroom, and it just provides some really good examples and some specific activities that you can do with students. And this is just, again, a really great tool to use that gets at that enhancement piece of the Triple E framework. It really allows us to understand that better. So when we look at evaluating enhancement, again, we have 3 questions this time that we're going to walk through. Okay, does the technology tool aid students in developing a more sophisticated understanding of the content or higher order thinking skills? Now, if we go back to the Google My Maps app and think about how students are using that, I think you could say that that definitely is allowing students to do more higher order thinking skills. They're really applying what they know about whether it be math or science or social studies within that map tool, and really creates that higher order thinking skills. The second question is, does the technology create scaffolds to make it easier to understand concepts, gather information, or generate ideas? Let's look again at the Google My Maps and think about this question. You can definitely do scaffolding within this. If you think about when we looked at transferring data, some of the steps students may go through. They may read a text or read some information, produce a graphic organizer to kind of organize that information, and then convert that into a map to really demonstrate what they've learned. It really gets into this scaffolding concept. And then, does the technology create paths for students to comprehend or demonstrate their understanding of the learning goal in a way they could not do with traditional tools? I think we could definitely say, again, if we go back to that example of Google My Maps, this is a tool that is very different from our traditional tools we've used maybe in social studies or science or language arts for students to use, and it really allows them to demonstrate their understanding of that learning goal. So, for example, that tool, I think you could apply it to a lesson and really meet these 3 criteria. So let's take a look at some scenarios in the book, and I'm going to stick with the scenarios we looked at last time and kind of see how we work through the Triple E framework for each one of those scenarios. If you remember last time, we took a look at scenario number 4. It was a kindergarten teacher focusing on early literacy goals of writing capital letters, and they had each student come up to the interactive whiteboard to write letters with the whiteboard pen. So the learning goal was students will be able to recognize letters and properly write capital letters. So let's take a look at those 3 questions. So the first question we have is, does the technology tool aid in developing a more sophisticated understanding of the content? I think we could probably say somewhat on this one, right? It allows the students to trace those letters and watch others do it. They're seeing the other students' feedback that they're getting from the teacher. But we could also probably do this on a regular whiteboard if each student had their own little whiteboard, or even up on the whiteboard, okay? They're not really engaged in any kind of reflective or creative practices because of the tool that the teacher is using. Let's look at the second question. Does the technology create scaffolds to make it easier to understand concepts? Really, we could probably say no on this one. There's really no scaffolding involved in this activity, right? This could be done paper and pencil, again, or on a blackboard. You could look at scaffolding in meeting the question number 2 if the teacher was really changing those tracing experiences based on the student's writing level. So if they're, for example, I know there's an app out there that my own kids have used where there's 3 different ways of tracing the letter on the app. There's a lot of support on the first one where they're just touching where you start to write the letter, and the app is showing them how to write it. On the second one, it's giving them guidance. So as they're writing, it's giving them a little prediction of where their finger needs to go to trace that letter. And then on the third level, there's no support embedded within that letter. They're just tracing the letter independently. That would be a way to really meet that question number 2 of creating scaffolding. Now, if we look at question number 3, does the technology create paths for students to comprehend or demonstrate their understanding in a way they could not do with traditional tools? And this one again is a no, right? It can be done with paper and pencil. Now, I did disagree with the author a little bit on this one. The author stated that paper and pencil may be better because a finger or a marker is not as easy as a traditional pencil for students learning writing. But there is some written language research out there that shows some of that finger letter development is supportive for students as they learn the correct way of forming a letter and really getting that embedded in their minds on what that letter looks like and how you form it. So that I would say kind of somewhat on this tool for question number 3. Let's look at scenario number 8. We looked at this one last time, but we're going to look at it in terms of enhancement this time. So a 9th grade English teacher studying memoirs, personal biographies, asks each student to text message a 6-word memoir or a short biography to an interactive website. The text message is then displayed anonymously that the teacher is projecting on a website. So the learning goal is students will understand the difference between a memoir and a biography by sharing examples of their own. So let's work through our questions again. Question 1. Is it developing a more sophisticated understanding of the content? Well, not really, right? The students are just sharing their memoirs. It's not really showing us any kind of different higher order thinking skills necessarily by doing this activity. Let's consider scaffolding within this. It's maybe somewhat addressing that scaffolding question and that the technology is making it easier to share the memoirs all at once and archive them, but it's really not differentiating for individual learners. Okay, it's really just allowing students to personalize their end product there. And then if we look at question 3, is it creating a different way for students to demonstrate their understanding of the learning goal that's different than the traditional tools we use in the classroom? Now, we could probably say somewhat, right? It's allowing them to share anonymously all at once, which we all know would be very difficult if we were doing a paper-pencil activity or even if we were having students come up to the whiteboard and writing those out. But they could also do this without the aid of the technology. So again, we're not quite there with scenario 8 on really meeting those enhancement questions. So as you really look through this chapter, I want you to think about really these 5 main points when we think about enhancement. Okay, and as you do the activity, I want you to really be thinking about these. Does the tool add value? Okay, how is it adding value to what we're doing in the classroom? Does it elicit that higher order thinking? Are students really taking what they've learned, applying it in a way that's challenging, that's really making them reflect on what they're learning? And does the tool really differentiate and personalize instruction? We all know that we've learned more and more about differentiated instruction and really looking at the students in our classroom. We know they're not all at the same level, right? We've got kids that need a little bit more support. We've got kids that are ready for a boost and ready to take things further. So how does the tool help us do that? And then does the tool really provide supports that traditional tools can't provide? I want you to think about those things as you look through the scenarios in the book and really be honest on those scenarios, on if you think it meets these, and if it doesn't, how would you tweak it? How would you change it to really meet those? And that's what you're going to be thinking about as you move on to the activity within this module and participating in the discussion.